Okay, good morning. It's time to get started. We're in Mark chapter 12. Starting a couple minutes late. In honor of someone, I won't say who, but. All right, Mark chapter 12, we're looking at 18 through 34. So we're pretty good chunk. We'll get, and then next week, hopefully we'll get through this chapter. If you would, please go with me to God in prayer. Father, thank you for the opportunity that we have to come together to study from your word. As we look into your word, we pray, Father, that you'll help us to see you better. We'll see Jesus more clearly. We'll see how to make application of these things, put them in practice in our own lives. We can emulate your Son and draw ourselves closer to you. Thank you for the forgiveness of sin that's offered to us through the sacrifice of your Son. Help us, Father, to appreciate that, to not take it for granted. And Father, when we face temptations and trials, we pray that you'll help us to find a way of escape. We will be able to endure it, and that we will bring you honor and glory in the way we behave. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, so Mark chapter 12, 18 through 34. Last week we finished up about the Pharisees, and I'll back up a little bit. And we talked about paying taxes and the question that was involved there and why that was such an important question. It's a good try, I guess you could say. The way it was phrased and the people that were there, it didn't seem like he had any way out. And of course, he answered it perfectly. And then we're moving into verse 18. It says, Then some Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him, and they asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies and leaves his wife behind and leaves no children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and dying, he left no offspring. The second took her, and he died, nor did he leave any offspring. And the third likewise. So the 7 had her and left no offspring. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, when they rise, whose wife will she be? For all 7 had her as wife. Jesus answered and said to them, Are you not therefore mistaken, because you do not know the scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But concerning the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the burning bush passage, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. You are therefore greatly mistaken. All right, we'll stop there. We're going to go on in a little bit to the next section. But this is a very interesting situation, because if you'll notice, right from the beginning in verse 18, it says, Then some Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him. And they're, of course, asking him a question related to the resurrection, right? So it's a little hypocritical in a sense. But what's the purpose of their question to Jesus based on that knowledge? To trick him. All right. And how's that? What are they trying to trick him into?
No matter what he says, they feel that he's going to be violating their custom.
Okay. In what way do you mean by that?
If he says that it's the first wife, but then the other 6 are not being taken care of, because they're looking at a physical type of kingdom.
They're looking at, yeah.
All 7, it's violating their understanding of adultery and fornication.
Okay, so if he says the first one, then the other ones are going to be left out and not taken care of. But if he says any of the other ones, then there's the adultery question that comes in. Okay. And so, yeah, we're looking at this from a purely physical standpoint. And this is the way commonly, as I understood it, people saw the resurrection. They discussed the resurrection is going to be very, very much a physical thing. Of course, we know that our bodies will be transformed into a spiritual body. We have no idea what that means, but we do understand that it's not flesh and bone that's going to flesh and blood that enters into the kingdom of heaven. It doesn't go to heaven. So we understand that, but they didn't have that kind of concept. And from what I read, some of the commentaries, several of them said that this is true in the Muslim religion too, that they have a very physical idea of it's very of the afterlife. It's very physically oriented because of the 70 virgins and things like this that they're waiting for them. Okay, but there's a big problem here, and that is the Sadducees don't even believe in the resurrection. So why would they even ask this question to begin with? What are they trying to prove? That what?
I was just thinking that he's not who he is. That they're wanting to get rid of him.
Uh-huh.
And if they present something that he would be like blaspheming or not telling God's way about it, then they can do what they want to do with him.
Right. So if they can convince, or if they can find a way to say that Jesus is teaching something that's not true. In their mind, of course, what's not true? The whole resurrection idea. So that this question was designed, it's probably something that they've debated with a lot of different people. It's some question that came up to try to prove a point. It's really the idea is that there is no answer. That's what they came up with. There's no answer to this. It's a dilemma that can't be answered. Therefore, it proves that the whole idea of a resurrection is absurd. That's what they're trying to prove. And so they get Jesus caught into this. Now, if Jesus responds saying, yeah, there is no resurrection, he's going to be in trouble for a lot of other reasons too, but from the Pharisees' standpoint, for sure. So there are a lot of things going on here, a lot of things in play. And Jesus is put into this situation, and he has this interesting question. Now, the question is based on the Levirate law, which is not something that's restricted to the law of Moses. In fact, it was probably in existence long before Moses was born. And this is something that we can even see evidence of way back in the book of Genesis, when we look at Abram, before he was even called Abraham. And who did he marry? His half-sister, right? That may not have been Levirate law, but it's something that's related to that idea that the Levirate law is something that was Levirate. I'm not sure exactly how to say it. Levirate, Levirate. So that law was not universal, but was practiced in a lot of places. And the reason for it was that they wanted to keep marriages within the bloodline. They didn't want to marry outsiders. And you can even see hints of why that would be the case, because if you go back even before the flood, when we have in Genesis chapter 6, one of the problems that was stated there, not only was it the fact that every intent of their thoughts were always evil continuously, but part of the problem was they started intermarrying with different people. So the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth began to intermarry, and there was lots of problems that came as a result of that because of the corruption that came really probably from Cain's lineage, corrupting the people that had been calling out to God previously to that. And so there was probably that could be where it comes from. And so they wanted to keep it within the family, so to speak. And so if a man had a wife and she had no children with him, he had no children. If he died, then his brother was supposed to take his wife and produce a child. This was to promote the bloodline, so that he would have someone to continue on in the heritage with the name. And that was a very important idea during this time. And so when Moses gave this would be in, let me see, I think it's Deuteronomy chapter 25. And it's not just prescribed, but it's also regulated. So Deuteronomy chapter 25, you're right, verse 5, says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. Now that's an interesting passage. And if you notice what he says, his name will not be blotted out in Israel. It does have something to do with the heritage it's going to receive when they have the land divided up, things like this. So it's probably what keep having that in mind. Although, like I said, it was very common. And he's probably simply just regulating what was already going to be practiced anyway. And the point of this is actually starting in verse 7, and that is, if he will not take her, if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go to the gate of the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. And the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. It's a very odd story, but this is exactly what it means. So there's a lot of cultural things going on here. Removing the sandal was cultural. And it had to do with humiliation. That kind of was a very humiliating thing to be spit in the face. Certainly would have been unclean as well. So there are a lot of things going on. So when they're asking this question, then they're trying to trick Jesus into thinking or into saying that there is no resurrection, and they're using this law as a basis for that. So what were the two reasons that Jesus gave for why they erred? Didn't know the scriptures and didn't know the power of God. Okay. So what did the scriptures say, or which scriptures say that when the dead rise, they will not be married, or they'll be like angels? It's a good question, isn't it? Jesus said they erred because they didn't know the scriptures. Their error was there is a resurrection. Okay. That's what their error really entails. And so where does it say that when they are raised, they won't be given in marriage? Are you aware of any places? I didn't see any. No, it doesn't say anything about it as far as I can see. Either yes or no, it doesn't address that. So we have to, in fact, it's interesting that he mentions the word angels here. Because when they say there is no resurrection, that is speaking of a realm, not just of humans, but also of other beings outside of God. So this is talking about angels, which is one of the reasons he talks about it, mentions it here. But so in what sense then can Jesus say they didn't understand the scriptures and then go on to say angels? Well, how were they supposed to know that we would be like angels if the scriptures actually don't say that we'll be like angels? Yeah. So he's saying that they didn't have any, I like the way you put that. They didn't have any spiritual discernment. So you can know some of the facts, but that doesn't mean you understand the principles and what's actually being said. And Jesus gives a great illustration about why there is a resurrection to prove that. But he tells them they don't know the scriptures, nor do they know the power of God. So what did the power of God have to do with the question that they asked? Ability to raise the dead. Right. Yeah, that's true. But their question was about the which man is going to have her. Does that relate to the power of God? Okay, so ultimately God's going to be able to decide who's going to get right. So yeah, it would relate then to God has the ability to work it out. There's no situation that okay, if what they brought up with this woman and these 7 brothers actually happened, which it's a possibility it could have. It's a hypothetical, but it's still a hypothetical, could be true. What happens if that actually was the case? Well, see, in the mind of the Sadducees, that just proved that since that's an impossible situation, that just proved that the resurrection actually isn't going to happen, because it would contradict what they see as the Bible teaching about the Levirate law. So who would get her? She can't be married to all 7 of them. And so that's their dilemma that they've created. Now, we can see through it, but that was a very good question for them, very astute, really. And Jesus's problem was he said their problem was they didn't understand the power of God. So God can make things happen. I have a very hard time limiting God. Now, God has limited himself in certain ways, as he said, for example, that he cannot lie. But there used to be things that I said, there's just some things that it's impossible for God to do. And I would almost start making a list. But then I started thinking about how do we actually know what God can and can't do? What seems to be impossible would be creating a being that falls away and then making it clean again. That should be impossible, but he's done it. He knew a way, he created a way. It took him thousands of years, but he accomplished what he set out to do. So it's really difficult for me to say that God can't do anything at all. I mean, there's some things that he can't do, even though the scriptures do teach that he will never violate his own character, right? But their problem was they didn't understand the scriptures and they didn't understand God. And so, that comes down to a lot of problems that we face too, doesn't it? A lot of the challenges that we face, it could be coming back down to that one of those 2 things, that we just don't believe in God enough. We don't understand him, or we don't understand the scriptures, or maybe both. Yes, ma'am.
That's what Molly said. Looking at this, it says, neither the power of God, they don't understand. And it immediately says, when they shall rise from the dead. And then it also says, the next verse, and it's touching the dead that they rise. And then in the next verse, he says, he is not the God of the dead, God of living. So there's 3 indications of rising from the dead.
Right.
Right after that, power of God.
Yeah, right. So my point is that he's going to address the raising of the dead. That's absolutely right. And that does have to do with the power of God. But he's also addressing the question that they had about which one would they be. Because if the dead were raised, they still have this dilemma of which man gets the wife. So yeah, so moving into that then, if you look at that, where he brings up the questions, he said, let's see here, where did it go? Verse 25, for when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But concerning the dead, that they rise, okay, now he's going to move into that, saying, here's proof that there is a resurrection that's coming. Concerning the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the burning bush passage, how God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. You're therefore greatly mistaken. Okay, so now my question is, if you just take that statement out of context, and he says that God is not the God of the dead, but the living, what about all the dead that has gone on before us? And it makes you think about the people that he's talking about who are dead when he's talking about it. What does he mean by that? Yes.
I am, not I was. I am. Because they still exist somewhere.
Yeah.
Which I think would give credence to what he's saying about resurrection.
Yeah, exactly. And that's his point. So when he says, I am the God of Abraham, the point that he's making is that if Abraham ceased to exist after his death, which is really what the resurrection entails. So that brings up another question. Where does it say that you, just because you don't believe in a resurrection, why do you automatically believe that you cease to exist when you die? Do those two correlate? In other words, if I don't believe in a resurrection, does that mean that I believe that when I die, I don't have a soul anymore? It's just gone? It seems to be what Jesus is tying the two together, right? So why would it be the case that when you die, there's no resurrection after that? I mean, why does that relate to, let me see if I'm asking this question right. How does it relate? How do those things relate? The resurrection and the fact that you might cease to exist. In other words, if you don't cease to exist, does that mean that you have to have a resurrection? Be in another realm. But he says that there's going to be a resurrection, right? So he's tying those two together. In other words, if you don't believe in the resurrection, then you obviously believe that you don't exist when you die. That's the implication, because he says, I'm the God of the living. And so if you look at verse 25, when they rise from the dead, verse 26, he said, concerning the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, I am the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Okay, so he is God of the living. That means they're alive. The fact that they're alive right now, does that mean that there's going to be a resurrection? Let me see if I can phrase it another way. All of us believe that Abraham is alive, right? Just not physically. Has he been resurrected yet? So is it possible, at least for a certain amount of time, that you can have a living being who's not walking around in the flesh, who hasn't been raised? So there's a difference between someone who's alive and someone who's been resurrected, right? And Jesus puts the two together. They're not separated. You see what I'm pointing at here? Or am I just confusing everybody? Isaac?
If that is what they believe, because, for example, Enoch didn't die, just taken away. How do they reconcile that? Where Enoch goes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how they reconcile that.
To be honest, I don't know how to answer your question.
Yeah. So they're just wrong. Sure. Yeah, they're definitely wrong. So Enoch is a good example of that. What happened to Enoch is God took him, right? We don't know where he went. Well, he went with God, but we don't know how that happened. And he's just gone. So the Sadducees, I don't know how they explained that. Maybe they just explained that they said, well, he just disappeared. We don't know where he went, but he's gone. So just like Abraham's gone, he's gone. When Jesus is answering this, we need to remember that he's talking to Sadducees. And what Isaac said is really the point. We can't look at this from perspective of 21st century Christians who are looking at this question, asking, what does he mean by that? He's saying it in the context of what the Sadducees believed. The Sadducees believed that not only that there was no resurrection, they believed that there was no spirit that lived on. They didn't see those two things were completely the same. So if you had a spirit that lived on, that means you're going to have a resurrection. You couldn't get around it. And so they believe that there is no resurrection because there's no spirit that lives on. That's why he brought in the angels. They didn't even believe angels existed. I don't know how they explain some of these passages, except for the fact that the Sadducees only accepted as God's word Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Everything else was commentary. They didn't believe anything else was actually from God. So when Jesus answered them, he went to that burning bush passage. That's why he didn't answer them from any of the other passages that would indicate a better understanding of what the resurrection was about. He dealt with them based on what they already believed, what they knew to be true. So what did he do? He went and talked about Abraham, things that God said to Moses that proved that he is the God of the living. So if Abraham is still living in their minds, that would mean that there's a resurrection, that they go hand in hand. They're the same thing, not necessarily the same, but they go hand in hand. So why would we go on living if we're not going to be raised from the dead? We're going to be brought back to life. They just refused to believe any of it. Jesus combined them together. And of course, if there is a spiritual realm, that's the only way we could have a resurrection, right? If there is. Okay, so does that make a little more sense? Does that help you a little bit? So it's coming from their perspective. And that's a very good thing for us to remember. So we're sitting around talking to people, studying the Bible with them, and you're going to sit down and talk to people who are Islamic. Where do you start? You start with where they believe. You start with where they are. And if they believe that Muhammad is a prophet, it doesn't do any good to insult them. You would want to start where they believe, and there are ways you can do it. You can look at their holy literatures and how that they refer to Jesus as a prophet. There are several places you can start, and you start with where they are, and you build on knowledge builds upon knowledge. So you start where they are, and you build upon where they are. So you start with Mormons the same way. You don't start by trying to destroy their thinking about their New Testament, the Second Testament, right? What do they call that? Another testament? Yeah. You don't start by trying to destroy that. You start with what they believe inside that will help them come to a realization that that's actually wrong. And you start there. This is what Jesus did with the Sadducees. He dealt with them where they were. That's a pretty important idea. And it really shows the brilliance of Jesus when he addressed people. He knew exactly what to say, when to say it, how to say it. And I wish I could be that way myself. Okay, so number 6, we already answered that one. How was God's statement to Moses proof of the resurrection? Number 7 is Mark chapter 12, verse 28. So let's move into that section here. Are there any comments or questions about this section before we move on? Robert. Yeah. Yes. No. Yeah, you're right. So what Robert said was verse 25. It says, when they rise from the dead, how are they supposed to know that? And that his point is that Jesus was going to give, this was an instruction. He's telling them something they didn't know before, which is true. And what they should have known was that there was a resurrection. That's what they should have known. That's what they didn't know because they didn't understand God, the power of God. So coming back to what Holly said, coming back to the resurrection. But they're misunderstanding and misinterpreting a passage to make it fit their agenda to try to prove that there was no resurrection. So they're misusing the passage to do that. Yeah, Holly? It's a good point. Mm-hmm.
And death, he has the power to separate them. And therefore there's power in what's going to be different when the resurrection
Yeah. It's almost like they thought that the resurrection meant that you actually came back to life. When you were gone for a long time, you're gone, and then you come back to life at the resurrection. So that means that you're alive again, so you should be married. You should have everything exactly like it was when you're on earth. But they completely misunderstood that. It's a good point. And what Jesus is saying is that, or what Holly said was that when you look at the passage about from Genesis chapter 2 about marriage, that they need to understand that they were married for life, and then when they died, God separated them out. And so they weren't bound to each other anymore. It's true. But that does reveal a misunderstanding of even the nature of the afterlife, what it is anyway. So, all right. And as far as what you were saying, Robert, about the vanity of living, if you don't think that there's a resurrection, I agree 100%. 1 Corinthians 15 is about that. But in their thinking, they didn't, corporate salvation was the concept of salvation for the Jewish people. They didn't believe necessarily individual salvation. They believed that corporate salvation meant that God would bless Israel and the nations of the earth would benefit because they're going to grow and expand and rule the earth. And that's what it was all about. And so it's very physical in that sense. And that's one of the reasons they could reject spiritual, the afterlife, because it was all about living for God's promises now, which to me, I agree with Robert, to me, that wouldn't be enough. I'd want a little bit more than that. Okay, so moving on to verse 28, it says, one of the scribes came and having heard them reasoning together, perceived that he had answered them well, asked him, which is the first commandment of all? Jesus answered them, first of all, the commandment is, of all the commandments is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second like it is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So the scribe said to him, well said, teacher, you have spoken the truth. For there is one God, and there is no other but he. And to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the soul, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is more than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. Jesus saw that he answered wisely. He said to him, you're not far from the kingdom of God. But after that, no one dared question him. That last sentence, no one dared question him, is because he kept giving them the answers. This is like they're putting out the best arguments that they could think of, and he's handling them with no problem at all. Okay, is there a dilemma with what he is trying to catch him, or what this man is bringing up to Jesus? Matthew chapter 22 and verse 35 says that he was trying to catch Jesus, or he's trying to test him. What is the catch here in asking this question? Looking for one of the 10. Yeah, it's very possible that's what it's about. As far as what I've been able to see, this is something that was hotly disputed among Pharisees, that they wanted to figure out which one was the greatest of all the laws, and they put them in order, and so there's a lot of arguing and fighting over which one was which. He's gonna, no matter what he answers, he could be in trouble by it. It's also possible that he's testing, but also he may already have an idea in his mind because he agrees with him. So maybe he's just testing and seeing, hey, is he going to argue with me? Because if he says one of the 10 commandments, I got him, because I could say, isn't it better to love the Lord your God with all your heart? Because if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, you're not going to break these 10 commandments. You're going to do what he tells you, right? So he's hoping perhaps that Jesus would say one of the other ones. So he'd have him right there. But Jesus doesn't answer that way. He answers correctly. All right. So let's see. That's where I think he's trying to catch him. Why was it wise for Jesus to not only give the first, but also the second greatest commandment to this man? He's only asked for the first. He gave him 2.
neighbor.
Mhm. Yes,
I think we show them that they're all summed up in. And also, I think we should be acting from the attitude of regulating laws and rules and follow that was spelled out so explicitly into the Christian mentality that if you love God and you love your neighbor, you will do right.
sure.
You know, do that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And so she said that you have the 10 commandments, and the first four are covered by love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and then the rest of them are covered by the love your neighbor as yourself, right? So it does certainly help with that mindset that this is all about love. It's not about ranking which one's the best, but in saying that number one and then number two, and he says all of the other ones fall under these, right? That's the whole point. And that's what they should have seen in the law of Moses, but they didn't see that. They had some 600 some odd regulations, and a lot of them were additions to what Moses said. And they had them in ranks by the most important. So if you did one, but you were obeying another one, and that violated that one, then that was okay because this one was more important. And there's all kinds of ways you can scheme and make things happen. You know, it's kind of like coming back to what Jesus said about swearing on the gold of the temple instead of swearing on the temple itself. There's all kinds of regulations and things of hierarchy of rank. Yeah, Harry?
Well, I didn't know what you said, I don't want to repeat it, but to me, the short answer is this. The first one is useless without the second.
The first one is useless without the second one. Okay, can you explain what you mean by that?
And if you only love God, you don't love your neighbor, then you haven't met the objective that God has for you.
Very good. So how can you say that you love God if you don't love your neighbor, right? So yeah, exactly right. Robert?
This is really important too. God, all commands go up to obey God.
Sure. Yeah, so if we obey the commandment, the first one to love God, we're going to obey the second one, obviously, to love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, how does this relate to the question that this man is asking him? It absolutely does. What, is he violating anything when he asked Jesus this question? He's not violating it? His motive is to catch him in his words. He's not asking this to find out information, to love God more. He's not asking this because he loves Jesus and wants Jesus to learn something. He's asking, trying to catch him in his word so he can put him in jail. Could that be another reason why he would say the second one? Absolutely. Not to discount any of the other things. It's all great what you said, but man, he really puts the nail in here with him. He does what he always does. He went right for the heart, right? Why are you asking me this? Don't you know you should love God and love your neighbor as yourself? So that's something interesting that's there. Again, showing Jesus's incredible wisdom. And I believe that could be why that last sentence there in that passage says that no one dared ask him anything else. Maybe he exposed the motives. A lot of reasons for that, perhaps, but I think it was a very astute thing to say. So what about Jesus's answer to this? And actually, both answers, because he had the question, then Jesus's answer, then the man's response, and then Jesus answered again. Think about Jesus's responses. And what does it show about his willingness to create and sustain relationships?
Basically said, said, love God greater than what all sacrifices. That's stepping a little forward, kind of the normal, Jewish mindset.
Yeah, I think you're right. So when the answer of the Pharisee or the scribe was what it was, when he said that where was it? I'm looking for the passage here, sorry. Oh, verse 33. To love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the soul, with all the strength is to love one's neighbors herself is more than all the whole burnt offering and sacrifice. That was a big step for him, perhaps. And it certainly wasn't something that was a norm that you can see, right? But although the scriptures did teach this all throughout the Old Testament, the Pharisees missed that. And so that's good. In Jesus' response to him, what did he say to him? You're not far from the kingdom. You are, that's to me, that's a pat on the back, right? That's an attaboy. You're doing good. You're close. He didn't say he was there, but he said you're close. So keep thinking along that line, right? Something that's another thing with me is that when Jesus was asked these questions, my thinking would be, I'm scared. I don't know what to say. Of course, I'm not Jesus, but I would be thinking, I need to find a way to get out of this and not answer the questions. But even when they were answering the questions, he still phrased the answers in such a way to make them think for their own benefit. So when he brought up again, for example, the second commandment, it was for the benefit of that person who was asking to maybe think about where he was. The same thing with the answer that he gave the Sadducees was to make them think. It wasn't just to answer that question. He answered the deeper question that they had, where they had the error. And in fact, in verse 27, when he says, he is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living, you are therefore greatly mistaken. The word mistaken there means literally you're fooling yourselves. You're tricking yourselves. And so he's trying to get them to think and wake up. Even though he knows that their motive was wrong, he's still trying to address them at the heart. And so it always was. When I said Jesus always went to the heart, it wasn't that he was trying to do gotchas. He's going to get right to the bottom of it and just make them suffer. It was he wanted to get to the heart and help them understand where they were and get out of that situation. He genuinely loved people. That's just amazing that he would be that way. Was that the second bell? Okay, well, we'll stop there. Thank you very much for your participation. Good discussion.